The book attempts to take a very big picture, broad brush approach at one level to this Indo-Pacific idea that has been, I think, framing foreign policy, certainly for Australia, and I think certainly also for India in recent years. So at one level, this is a history book, and perhaps that's just as well, because with the rapid changes in the region, I think, as I say in the introduction to the book, anything you write about the near future is a gift to fate, and fate is going to keep taking that gift and surprising you. But I make the argument that, in fact, there's been a very long arc of regional history, a somewhat submerged regional history of our shared maritime region, and that in a sense, the Indo-Pacific idea, it's not actually as new as many of us suspected. And I think there are many in India who realised it wasn't new. The book makes a strong argument that there is, particularly since the 1940s, a submerged Indian current, if you like, in the Indo-Pacific idea. But also that this long view of our region's history actually gives us a foundation for multipolar solidarity in managing Chinese power, because the book argues this was a region where China was always prominent, or not always prominent, but mostly prominent, but never dominant across the broader region. And so the myth making, the fake news or the fake olds, if you like, of the Belt and Road, the idea that China has some natural centrality to a much larger maritime Asian-centric region is simply not true. And the book makes that case. I might, if I may, Indrani, I might jump into the thesis of the book a little bit more before. What I'd like to do is get to the so what for our policymakers. And of course, I'm sure in the discussion section, our participants are going to want to talk about what happens next, including in the COVID context.
That's right. Please do so. I mean, that would be actually very useful.
I'll do that and hope to see Harsh again. So I will inflict a few maps, if you don't mind, on the audience, because the book is partly about maps and about how mental maps help policymakers really reimagine the region, and I think take quite bold steps in policy. And I'd say, from an Indian context, certainly the speech that we heard Prime Minister Modi give in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue several years ago was a real marker for India there. So let's jump into the map. So I'm going to share my screen here and go straight to a few slides just to share with viewers, and I assume you can all see this now, how this Indo-Pacific idea works in a practical sense and in terms of a regional vision to help our countries make foreign and security and indeed geoeconomic policy. So this first, I've got about 10 maps I'll quickly skim through. This first frame is a version of the official Australian government concept of the Indo-Pacific. The Australian government 7 years ago, round about the time that I was first interested in this idea, released a defence white paper that focused on the sea lanes of communication, of energy, of trade that unite and bind our region, and then I think certainly put India and Australia in the same strategic frame. And so this, if you like, is the contemporary Indo-Pacific. We're all pretty familiar with this now, the unity of those sea lanes, the connectivity, bringing South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Australasia and North America all together in the one frame and extending over to Africa, the Middle East and beyond. What's interesting though is that as I got researching this, and of course a lot of my thinking in this space began, I hate to say it now, my beard is getting a bit grey, but 20 years ago when I was first posted to the Australian High Commission in New Delhi, and I was looking for those, I guess, hidden currents of convergence of interest between Australia and India. The research actually takes us back a long way. And so if you start looking at the conceptions mentally and in maps of an Asia-centric region, but a region that is not purely Asia, throughout history, there's an extraordinary pattern that you see. So you go from this contemporary vision right back to this map from Korea in 1402, that captured in an idea of the world as seen by East Asia and Europe at the same time, because this map was a combination of East Asian and European ideas of the world. And in fact, that enormous mass in the middle of the map is, of course, a combination of essentially India and China, South Asia and continental East Asia. Quite central, but if you note the emphasis on the coastlines, so many of the settlements are around the coastlines, the archipelago of Southeast Asia, Africa's over there with a rather interestingly shaped lake in the middle of it. This was a single frame of the world as perceived 600 or more years ago. And so even then, what we imagine as Asia was essentially, in my view, more of a maritime region than a continental region. The maritime and the continent mattered most where they, I guess, touched one another in the ports. And this has a bearing on, of course, the current Indo-Pacific debate over port infrastructure. And then you see throughout subsequent history, the European colonial era, the idea of maritime Asia that dominated really right through until the 20th century, was again this single frame, this Indo-Pacific frame. This particular map from 1571, one of the first vaguely authentic, or I should say vaguely accurate, European maps of the region by Ortelius, the Dutch map maker, captures again India, Southeast Asia, North Asia, North America, and even if you look in the bottom corner, Australia, with the intriguing word beach there. They knew something about Australia even then, all in the one frame. And interestingly, again, although there may be mermaids and sea monsters, which, yes, they're mythical, but then so is the 9-dash line. Interestingly, this map accentuated the maritime region, a connected maritime region, as essentially a single strategic and economic system. The book goes further, I guess, back into history, and I don't have maps to illustrate that, but the book also takes us back to the pre-modern period, to the ancient period, to I guess, India's maritime empires, to, of course, the Southeast Asian civilizations heavily influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, India's cultural exports, and makes the point that really, really throughout history, the most recurring thread has been, hello Harsh, I take it you're back. I'll pause for you in a moment. The recurring thread has been connectivity across this vast maritime space. I might pause there, and I'd like to jump to the present day in a moment. But Harsh, I wonder if you wanted to reframe a little. I've started a journey through the many maps in the book, and I guess their relevance to the present day.
No, I'm extremely sorry, Rory, for this, but I think maybe you can continue your conversation, and I'll come back at the end and then do an overview.
That sounds good. So I'm in full flight. So I was just talking about the myths and the map making and the 9-dash line and its interesting parallel with mermaids. But let's jump to the present. So, there was this, I guess, pattern of connectivity, of culture, of trade, of some degree of political and even strategic contact between the different sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific, going right back to ancient times, even to before recorded history. And throughout the colonial era, and of course colonialism both broke the region and broke the connections between the many Asian civilizations in the region, but also connected the region to a global system at the same time in patterns that we still see today. Throughout that colonial period, again, the typical concept of Asia was a single frame, a region where really maritime connectivity was dominant. This particular French map or Australian maps that you see from the 17th and the 19th centuries. And it really wasn't, I argue, and my research argues, until the middle of the 20th century that a lot of these actually more artificial ideas about the region, particularly the idea of the Asia-Pacific, were created for important political purposes of their time. But their days were numbered. And interestingly, the book even draws parallels between some of these old European colonial conceptions of the region and, I guess, China's ambitions for the region, the Belt and Road. And there's a particular map that we'll come back to perhaps later in the conversation the contemporary Chinese map in this frame, which we see in more detail here, that I think captures very starkly, very powerfully Chinese strategic ambition and the use of mental maps as kind of strategic wish-making, if you like, an idea of how China wants to perceive the world and the region that it wants to dominate. And of course, as we see here, America is essentially bisected and cast to the outer darkness of the globe. All this map talk is kind of erudite and historically interesting, but I want to jump to the core theme of the book in a moment and begin the discussion about the present day, just by again bringing viewers' attention to the parallels between all of these visions throughout history, going right back to essentially medieval times, the colonial era, the post-colonial era, because of course a lot of the Pan-Asian resistance to European colonialism, the links between India and Southeast Asia and Japan and China indeed, were in their sense Pan-Asian and to some extent Indo-Pacific in character. But then to the present day, where we're beginning to see a return, and the book argues we're seeing a return of the Indo-Pacific rather than a brand new conception of the region as a single strategic system, bringing together East Asia, South Asia, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. And this is where we get to, I guess, the heart of the story, the China dimension. The book opens with an account of particularly the diplomacy between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe of Japan several years ago, where India and Japan heavily influenced one another in devising their own Indo-Pacific viewpoints. The idea that particularly as their own interests and China's interests and activity expanded across this large two-ocean strategic space, it made very good sense for India and Japan to join forces to the extent that they could, to find solidarity with one another and with others such as Australia, and importantly, to work as Japan has done to influence the United States to see the region more in this light. And although, as the book notes, it's been the Chinese leadership, so for example, Chinese foreign minister has dismissed the Indo-Pacific as an idea that I guess is an attention-grabbing idea that will dissipate like ocean foam, I think is what he said. At the same time, that's because China perceives risk in this very idea of the Indo-Pacific, this idea that because the region is a large strategic system, therefore countries in different parts of the region, such as Japan, India, Australia, Indonesia, United States, perhaps even some of our European friends like the French, who are resident powers here, that these countries can essentially find common cause in managing and limiting and establishing, I guess, principled limits to Chinese power. It's not containment, but of course the Chinese like to call it that. The irony is, as the book argues, that although China claims to reject the Indo-Pacific idea, it's actually China's own behaviour and interests and actions. Look at the Belt and Road, look at the activities of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean, look at the military base at Djibouti, look at China's attempts to exert influence through Pakistan and others in the region. China is the most Indo-Pacific of powers. And so the book concludes by looking at, again, the connectivity of the region, the idea that both, I guess, cooperation, but also risk, contagion indeed, can spread rapidly in this region. And although the book doesn't dwell at length on pandemics, I went to print on the 8th of January, nonetheless, the book does look at black swan events that could really cascade throughout this region. I conclude with the argument, and I'll jump out of the maps there if you like. I will conclude with the argument that, excuse me a moment, I conclude with the argument that to manage Chinese power in this vast region, this Indo-Pacific region where China's interests and activity has expanded so rapidly over the past really 20, 27 years, dating back to when China became a net oil importer in 1993, there is agency for middle players, that is countries that are not the United States or China, there is potential for solidarity, and the starting point for that is really a recognition of our shared interests in this common strategic space. And so the book, I guess the more controversial subtitle of the book, Why China Won't Map the Future, the book is not about Chinese collapsism. It's not about the idea that China is doomed. I think it is about the idea that the PRC spends a lot of money and time and effort looking stronger than perhaps it actually is on the inside. The argument makes that China is not learning the lessons of empires past and is at serious risk of overreach, of overstretch across this Indo-Pacific over the next 10, 20, 25 years. The challenge for us, and this is where I'd love to perhaps get to the discussion, the challenge for the rest of us is to have a certain degree of staying power, a certain degree of solidarity, and to learn how we can set limits to Chinese power in this region, but actually, I guess, you know, in an unusual kind of way, help China to find a settling point, point before its overreach and hubris brings another, I guess, crisis to the region. Now, there's plenty more to talk about. There's obviously the whole question of how COVID will shake things up, but I hope that provides you all with a starting point and a tantalising introduction to the book.